When I first met my college roommate, Tom, I thought I had lucked out. Most roommate horror stories start right away. Arguments, messes, awkward tension, but Tom was different. Not bad. Just strange in a way that felt harmless, almost charming. On move-in day, while I was struggling to drag my suitcase up the stairs, he casually explained that he avoided stepping on sidewalk cracks. Not because of superstition, but because he believed each crack contained a tiny universe. According to him, stepping on one meant wiping out entire civilizations. I laughed, assuming he was joking. He wasn't. Tom had rules for everything. He carried a rubber stamp in his backpack and would randomly stamp people's hands approved or denied based on their outfit choices, claiming he was part of an underground fashion authority. He kept a plastic lawn chair in the shower because, as he put it, standing showers are for peasants. And when we went through drive-thrus, he used a tiny megaphone to place his order, insisting it prevented misunderstandings between consumer and provider. It was weird but funny weird. Least at first. As the semester went on, I got used to his eccentric habits. They became part of the background noise of college life. Honestly, compared to horror stories I'd heard from friends, I thought I'd gotten one of the better roommates. Then Tom asked me out. Not in a normal way, of course. One evening, he handed me a small box. Inside was a 3D printed human heart, detailed, anatomical, and disturbingly realistic. He cleared his throat, clutched his chest dramatically and wheezed, "You stole my heart," before collapsing onto the floor like he'd been shot. Froze. When I realized he was serious, I gently told him I wasn't interested. I tried to be kind, respectful. I didn't laugh or mock him. I just said no. Something changed after that. Almost overnight, the quirky guy I lived with vanished. In his place was someone colder, messier, and increasingly difficult to be around. Tom, who had once been oddly tidy, stopped cleaning entirely. Everything he owned began accumulating in a single growing pile in the living room. Clothes, textbooks, dishes, trash, and half-eaten food mashed together into one disgusting heap. At first, I thought it was temporary. Stress. Midterms. No. But the pile kept growing. The smell came next. Open cans of food were left on the counter for days. Takeout containers sat untouched until mold bloomed inside them. Fruit flies appeared, then ants. When I brought it up casually, he shrugged and told me to relax because he was busy with school. The worst part wasn't the mess. It was his attitude. He stopped joking, stopped smiling. When I asked if something was wrong, if my rejection had upset him, he wouldn't answer. He'd just stare at me in silence until I got uncomfortable and walked away. Then came the comments. Whenever I had friends over, Tom would make remarks just loud enough for us to hear, about bodies, appearances, or how close we all looked sitting together. Once he joked about us getting intimate, then laughed like it was nothing. My friends stopped visiting, and I started feeling trapped. One weekend I came home from a study group to absolute chaos. Loud music, dozens of strangers packed into our apartment, drinks everywhere, my personal belongings being passed around by drunk people who didn't know or care that they weren't theirs. I locked myself in my room that night, shaking with anger and humiliation. The next morning, Tom brushed it off like I was overreacting. That was when I realized something important. This wasn't awkward anymore. It wasn't quirky. And it definitely wasn't safe. I thought reporting him would make things better, but I had no idea that speaking up would turn my roommate into my worst nightmare. After the party, something inside me finally snapped. I couldn't keep pretending this was normal roommate conflict. The mess, the comments, the constant unease. It all blended into a heavy knot in my chest that never really went away. Every time I unlocked the apartment door, I braced myself, wondering what version of Tom I'd be dealing with that day. I tried one last calm conversation. I told him the noise, the parties, and the mess were affecting my studies. I explained how uncomfortable his comments made me feel, especially around my friends. I even apologized if I'd somehow upset him in the past, hoping that maybe kindness would soften whatever resentment he was holding on to. He didn't apologize back. He didn't even deny it. He just stared at me, expression flat, then rolled his eyes and said I was being dramatic. That was when I realized reasoning with him wasn't going to work. A few days later, after finding spoiled food leaking onto the counter and bugs crawling near the sink, I finally went to the university housing office. My hands were shaking as I explained everything. The mess, the parties, the comments, how unsafe I felt in my own home. The staff listened carefully, nodded, and took notes. They assured me they would look into it. For the first time in weeks, I felt a little lighter. That feeling didn't last. Tom found out. I don't know how, whether the housing office contacted him or someone let it slip, but that evening he cornered me in the kitchen. His voice was low and tight as he accused me of trying to ruin his life. He stepped closer, blocking the doorway, demanding I withdraw my complaint. When I hesitated, he leaned in and told me things would get a lot worse if I didn't fix what I'd done. I believed him. The next day, terrified and exhausted, I went back to the housing office and told them I'd exaggerated due to academic stress. I watched their concerned expressions shift to polite professionalism as they closed the case. Walking out, my stomach sank. I had made a huge mistake. Tom's behavior escalated almost immediately, like my silence had given him permission. The mess returned with a vengeance, but now there was something else, something deliberate. In the bathroom, he began leaving small jars on the counter. Inside were nail clippings, strands of hair, each jar labeled with dates like some twisted collection. I stopped using the shared bathroom whenever possible. The kitchen became unbearable. One afternoon, a foul smell hit me as soon as I opened the door. Sitting on the counter was a carton of eggs, left out of the fridge for weeks. The shells had darkened. Tiny insects hovered around them. Over time, the eggs seemed to rot from the inside, turning into something that looked less like food and more like a science experiment gone wrong. When I finally asked him to throw them away, his response was calm but terrifying. "No," he said. "And don't touch them." I didn't. By spring break, I was barely sleeping. That's when Tom invited several friends to stay over for just the weekend. The weekend stretched into nearly a week. They were just like him, loud, messy, careless. Dishes piled in the sink. Food spilled everywhere. The apartment smelled like sweat, trash, and stale alcohol unless I cleaned it myself. I stayed in my room as much as possible. One night there was a knock at my door. One of his friends stood there. Too close, smiling too wide. He commented on how cozy my room looked and tried to push the door open with his foot. When I told him I needed space, he laughed and said he wouldn't mind sleeping next to a pretty girl. I slammed the door and locked it. Later that night, I overheard them laughing in the living room. Tom joked about calling dibs on me. One of his friends suggested making a bet about who could get to me first. I didn't sleep at all. I pushed my dresser against the door and sat on the floor, clutching my phone, listening to every sound. I felt hunted in my own home. By morning I knew one thing for certain. Staying quiet had only made me a target. The next morning I made a decision that would put me in more danger, but it was the only way I could escape what was coming next. By the time the sun came up, I felt like I had aged years overnight. My body was stiff from sitting on the floor, my phone still clutched in my hand like a lifeline. Every noise from the apartment sent a jolt of panic through me, even after the laughter in the living room faded into snores. When I finally heard silence, it didn't bring relief, only the heavy realization that I couldn't live like this anymore. I waited. Once I was sure everyone was asleep, I packed a small bag with the essentials: clothes, toiletries, my laptop, and important documents. I moved slowly, carefully, terrified that even the smallest sound would wake someone. When I finally slipped out the front door, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my keys. I didn't go back. For the next few days I stayed with friends, sleeping on couches and spare beds. Even though I was physically safe, my mind stayed stuck in that apartment. I jumped at loud noises. I replayed everything I'd heard that night over and over, wondering if I'd imagined it, or if things would have turned even darker if I hadn't locked myself in. Tom eventually texted me. "They're gone." That was it. No apology. No explanation. The message was supposed to reassure me, but instead it made my stomach twist. The fact that he thought those 2 words fixed everything showed how little he understood, or cared, about the fear he'd created. I returned briefly, only during the day, and only to grab more clothes. That's when I noticed something new. On the bathroom counter sat another small jar. Inside were teeth. I couldn't tell if they were human or animal. I didn't want to know. Seeing that jar snapped something inside me. This wasn't just immaturity or poor hygiene. This was disturbing. And I had been too scared to fully acknowledge it. That was when I decided I needed proof. Not feelings. Not explanations. Evidence. Over the next few weeks, I became methodical. Every time Tom was out, I documented everything. I took photos of the rotting food, the insect infestations, the piles of trash. I recorded audio of his late-night rants, his parties, the way he spoke about me when he thought I couldn't hear. I kept everything backed up in multiple places. Each click of my camera felt risky, but also empowering. For the first time, I felt like I was doing something instead of just surviving. One afternoon, I knew Tom had a long lab scheduled. 3 hours minimum. I decided it was my chance to document the one place I'd avoided until now. His bedroom. The door creaked softly as I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Old food. Wet. Something sour I couldn't identify. Dirty laundry was piled high in one corner. Food containers stacked in another. On a shelf, I saw rows of jars, nail clippings, hair, all neatly labeled with dates. My hands trembled as I took photos. I crouched down to capture a mold-covered sandwich lying on the floor when I heard it. The front door opening. My heart nearly stopped. Panic flooded my system. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. My mind raced as I scrambled for an excuse, shoving my phone into my pocket and standing up. I straightened a few items on his desk, pretending to tidy, something he knew I did compulsively in shared spaces. Footsteps approached. I held my breath. Then I heard the fridge open. I didn't waste the opportunity. Moving as quietly as possible, I slipped out of his room and into the living room, grabbing a book and forcing myself to look calm. When Tom finally appeared, he joked about me spring cleaning. I laughed weakly and said I was just keeping busy. He didn't suspect a thing. As soon as he disappeared back into his room, I felt my knees nearly give out from relief. I had everything I needed. Now all that was left was to do the one thing I had been terrified to do again. Report him for real this time. And I promised myself I wouldn't back down. I thought gathering evidence was the hardest part, but I had no idea how quickly things would unravel once I finally turned it in. Walking back into the university housing office felt nothing like the first time. Before, I had been nervous and unsure, worried about overreacting. This time I was calm, but only because I had reached the point where fear had turned into resolve. I sat down, opened my laptop, and told them I wasn't retracting anything. I was done protecting someone who had made my life unbearable. I showed them everything. Photos of rotting food crawling with insects. Videos of the apartment filled with trash and strangers. Audio recordings of late-night comments that still made my skin crawl when I listened to them again. I explained the threats, the intimidation, and how unsafe I felt in my own home. The mood in the room shifted. The staff stopped nodding politely and started exchanging looks. One of them left the room and returned with a supervisor. I watched their expressions turn from concern to disbelief, then to something closer to alarm. For the first time I felt believed. They told me they would act immediately. An inspection was scheduled within days. I was warned not to confront Tom and to limit contact as much as possible. Hearing that validation, someone finally acknowledging that this wasn't normal, nearly made me cry. The inspection happened faster than I expected. Housing officials arrived unannounced while I was away. Tom had no time to prepare, no chance to hide the mess or the jars or the smell that had soaked into the walls. When I returned later that evening, the apartment felt Different. Quiet. Heavy. Tom didn't speak to me. The next morning, campus security knocked on the door. I stayed in my room as voices filled the hallway. I heard drawers opening, footsteps pacing, and then raised voices. Tom protested, accused them of overreacting, claimed I was lying. But the evidence was everywhere. Visible, undeniable. Within an hour, it was over. Tom was escorted out of the apartment, arguing the entire time. I watched from behind my locked door as he was led away. His belongings stuffed into bags. His anger echoing down the hall. When the door finally shut behind him, the silence felt unreal. I expected relief. What I felt instead was exhaustion. Housing arranged for me to move immediately. By the end of the week, I was transferred to a new dorm, this time with no roommate. The university apologized for not intervening sooner, and assured me they were reviewing how they handled similar complaints. The first night in my new room, I slept for 12 hours straight. No noises, no smells, no fear. Still, the experience lingered. For weeks, I caught myself double-checking locks and flinching at unexpected sounds. Took time to unlearn survival mode, to remember what it felt like to live without constantly watching my back. But slowly, things improved. Focused on my classes. I reconnected with friends. I started feeling like myself again. Looking back, I realized how dangerous silence can be. I had ignored red flags, minimized my fear, and blamed myself for someone else's behavior. Standing up for myself had been terrifying, but it was also the only thing that saved me. If there's one thing I learned, it's this. Discomfort is not something you owe anyone. If a situation feels wrong, it probably is. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is refuse to stay quiet. But just when I thought it was finally over, I discovered something that made me realize how close I'd come to something far worse. I thought the worst was behind me once Tom was gone. The apartment was quiet now. Too quiet, almost. No random shouting. No foul smells drifting from the kitchen. No jars appearing where they didn't belong. For the first time in months, I could breathe without feeling like my chest was being crushed. But peace has a strange way of making you reflect. A few days after moving into my new dorm, I returned to the old apartment one last time to collect mail and make sure I hadn't left anything important behind. Campus staff had already cleaned most of it, but traces of Tom still lingered. Faint stains on the carpet, scratches on the walls, and a heaviness in the air that hadn't quite faded. That's when I found it. Behind a kitchen cabinet, wedged so deep it must have been intentional, was a small notebook. The cover was bent and stained, like it had been handled too many times. I hesitated before opening it, already feeling that familiar twist of dread in my stomach. I wish I hadn't. The notebook was filled with pages of obsessive rambling. Observations about me. What time I left for class, who I spent time with, how long I stayed out. Some entries were written like jokes, others like plans. There were comments about how I owed him for rejecting him, how I would eventually come around, how everyone always took his side. Reading it made my hands go numb. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't hurt feelings. It wasn't even just resentment. It was fixation. Suddenly, every strange behavior made sense. The jars, the mess, the intimidation, the way he encouraged his friends to cross boundaries. It wasn't chaos. It was control. A way to make me uncomfortable, scared, and powerless in my own home. I handed the notebook to housing staff immediately. Their reaction confirmed my fear. They thanked me for bringing it in and assured me it would be added to his file. While they couldn't share details, they strongly suggested I continue staying in my single dorm and avoid any contact with him moving forward. That night, reality hit me hard. I replayed every moment where I had brushed off my instincts. Every time I had told myself I was overreacting. Every excuse I made for behavior that clearly wasn't okay. I realized how close I'd come to something far worse. Not because I was careless, but because I had been conditioned to stay polite and quiet. The guilt faded, replaced by clarity. I wasn't weak for being afraid. I was strong for getting out. In the weeks that followed, I started talking about what happened. Not publicly, but with friends, counselors, and people I trusted. Each conversation made the weight a little lighter. Sharing my story didn't make me feel exposed. It made me feel grounded. I also learned something unexpected. So many people had similar stories. Different details, same pattern. A slow shift from harmless to hostile. Boundaries tested, then ignored. Fear creeping in so gradually that it felt normal by the time it wasn't. That realization changed how I saw everything. I stopped minimizing my feelings. I stopped apologizing for needing safety. I stopped convincing myself that endurance was the same thing as strength. Real strength, I learned, is leaving. By the end of the semester, my grades were stable, my sleep had improved, and I felt present again. Not just surviving, but living. Still, there was one final thing left to do. One final step that would truly close this chapter. I thought walking away was the end. But the final outcome shocked me more than anything Tom had ever done. By the time finals week arrived, I thought I had already paid the full emotional price for what happened. I was wrong. A few days before the semester ended, I received an email from the university requesting a meeting. The subject line was vague, and my stomach dropped the moment I saw it. Part of me worried that somehow this would all be dragged up again, that I'd be questioned, doubted, or blamed one last time. Instead, the meeting brought something I never expected. Closure. The housing supervisor explained that after Tom was removed, the university conducted a deeper review of his behavior, not just toward me, but across multiple complaints that had gone unreported or dismissed in the past. My evidence, combined with what they uncovered, revealed a consistent pattern of harassment, intimidation, and violations of student conduct policies. I wasn't the only one. That knowledge hit hard, but it also brought relief. It meant I hadn't imagined anything. I hadn't overreacted. And most importantly, it meant I had stopped something that could have continued or escalated with someone else. Tom was officially barred from campus housing. Additional restrictions were placed on him that prevented any contact with me. The university acknowledged their failure to act sooner and committed to revising how they handle housing complaints, especially those involving safety concerns. For the first time since move-in day, I felt like the power imbalance was gone. I walked out of that office lighter than I had in months. Life slowly returned to normal. I finished the semester, packed up my dorm, and went home for break with a sense of peace I didn't realize I'd been missing. The constant tension I'd lived with had faded, replaced by something steadier: confidence. Looking back, I no longer think of that year only as trauma. I think of it as a turning point. I learned how easily unsettling behavior can hide behind humor. How important it is to trust discomfort, even when you can't yet explain it. And how silence, while it feels safer in the moment, often gives harmful behavior room to grow. Most of all, I learned that protecting yourself is never an overreaction. If sharing this story helps even one person recognize red flags sooner, or feel less alone in speaking up, then it's worth telling. No one should feel like a prisoner in their own home. I started college hoping for independence and growth. I got something different, but in the end I gained something just as valuable: my voice. If you're living with someone who makes you feel unsafe, uncomfortable, or afraid, don't wait. Trust yourself. Speaking up might just save you from a nightmare you don't see coming yet.